Hi everybody, it's Mr. Shakowski. I'm going to see if I can relay some more information to people who may be wondering about our upcoming test quiz and how it works and what it looks like and how to prepare for it. I'm going to have to talk really quick. I just got told I'm going to need to vacate the place that I'm sitting in to make this video right now. So we're going to do this as quickly as we can and see how it works. First things first, with respect to where we're at in the week here, it's Wednesday. We're a couple days away from the quiz. I anticipate actually holding the quiz during our live Teams meeting, which means it'll be Friday afternoon. And so that's the first thing to understand, is that the expectation is that you will be logging in and taking at least some part of that quiz online in real time with me, as opposed to us having a debate class or a discussion class. This is going to be test time. Okay, so I'll explain more once you guys are all online and in how exactly it's going to work. I'm still working out the details on that, but it's highly likely that at least part of this test you will be writing it literally on the spot, typing up your answers and sending them in to me by email. Certainly the long answer stuff anyways. So that's the first thing to understand. The next thing I want to show you, okay, yeah, oh great, okay, so one of the two major kinds of questions that you should expect to get on this test is what I call box questions. And this is something that we talked about before our first test of the year, which took place right around the time that schools were starting to prepare to go away. And so not everybody was able to write that test, but basically it involves sort of thematic questions, right? And one of them that I'd want to make sure we talk a little bit more about today is these 3- and 4-letter words in the news. And really what that is a cutesy way of saying, look, there are certain organizations and other things, I guess, that have acronyms that are often used in place of the full name, especially in headlines. So for you to understand what these acronyms stand for is pretty important to being able to understand the news. And so there are lots of times where different organizations or circumstances call for an acronym in the news, and that's its own its own category that I would sort of recommend you study and try to compartmentalize any notes you've been making and just look at things that involved acronyms like RCMP, or the CERB is one, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. This has been an acronym that's been in the news a lot in the last 6 weeks because that's one of Canada's major ways of helping people who need money while they've lost or had their hours curtailed, lost their jobs, or had their hours cut because of the pandemic. This was a major response that the government developed in order to help people financially. So, CERB, and what I would expect on a test is for you to tell me what these things stand for and then why they've been in the news. What you're seeing here on this exemplar answer key is from a test that took place a couple of years ago. And what you'll likely get from me on Friday is, 3 or 4 of these categories. I'll ask you to pick which 3 you like the best and then fill them out, but type them out. And so what you're missing here from this answer key is actually what MGEU stands for. And I didn't have room because I put tons and tons and tons of examples of good answers in here when I make my answer keys. And I already know what Manitoba Government Employees Union, what that acronym is. But on a test, I would expect you to actually tell me what the acronym stands for part of the mark, and then the rest of the mark comes from why that organization or group or thing has been in the news. Okay, so that's one type of question that you should expect to get. And sometimes they're categorized in major categories like local or national events, right? And they're always going to be recent and major. That's something to keep in mind. This test is basically going to call on you to talk about major news events that have happened since our first test, basically since spring break. It would be a good way to think of that, right? So it's almost 2 months worth of news now. And that's something to keep in mind. But sometimes I kind of subcategorize it, natural disasters or environmental news, and that becomes its own box, and you can go into various specific points there as well. Okay, so this is one major type of question that you should expect for Friday's test. Another major kind of question will be sort of more shorter answer, right? Fill in the blank type things. But when I say fill in the blank, it's very rarely the case that these fill in the blanks will be, 1 or 2 word answers or one guy's name or somebody's name. It'll often be, who is Bashar al-Assad is one part of the question, and then why have they been in the news recently? And that means you have to answer both parts for full marks. So again, this is from a test from a couple of years ago, but it shows you the kind of style of question that you can likely expect to get on this quiz on Friday. And these 2 types of questions will sort of consume the overwhelming majority of this quiz. If there's another type of question that's even longer answer, it'll be something that asks you to sort of give your opinion about an issue in the news lately. Or maybe I might ask you an open-ended question about major COVID-related news, for example. And that gives you a lot of freedom and flexibility to sort of talk about what are the major things that have happened that are COVID-related news, and sort of encapsulate them all in a paragraph and talk about the major pieces, not the small stuff, not the little details, but fairly big stuff. If somebody said, look, you've got 5 minutes here, tell me everything you possibly can about what's been going on with respect to this pandemic, both locally, nationally, and internationally, and then go. You would have to distill down, all the news that's happened in the last 2 months and come up with the most important pieces and write them in a kind of coherent, organized way. And so that could be a third type of question that you would get, and that would be the size of the topic that you'd be asked to talk about. Or I might give you a scenario and say, agree or disagree with the following statement, and then you'd have to think about that on the spot and then write an agree or disagree to that statement. That would be another kind of long answer question that's very typically done on tests like these. But again, I would recommend that you prepare for this test mostly by going through your old notes so that you can answer these types of questions and those box types of questions. Okay, so that's the first thing to sort of understand about this test and how it's going to be organized. Now, with respect to where you can go, for help with this, well, first of all, my expectation is that you've been making news notes all along. I want to remind you that I typed for you a set of news notes and sent them out to you got to be at least a month ago at this point. I don't have the date handy, but that's going to sort of your homework to figure out. But I after seeing a relatively few people's news notes in those early days of making news notes, I went to the trouble of creating a very detailed set of news notes for everybody and sent them out as part of an email, I believe, and that would have been back in April sometime. So there's some notes there that were well made and made by me to sort of represent several weeks worth of news. And a couple weeks ago, I think we were on a class on a Friday afternoon, and I ended up going on a bit of a sort of side trip and sort of talking to you about local and national news that I had been following lately. And what I wanted to do at this point was talk to you a little bit more about some of the other pieces that I just didn't have time for. I sort of wanted to end that video at that time. But for example, right, like when we get to, major recent news in the last couple months, I would expect, for example, that you kind of know about the major shooting that happened in Nova Scotia in Canada as a national news story. And, more recently, there's been more national news stories that have come through that have nothing to do with pandemic per se. And these are the types of stories that I'm going to be mostly focusing on. If there is like a pandemic related question, it'll be a fairly narrow and minor part of this overall test. I'm looking for other stories that you've been following in the news. So, for example, in the last 2 months, it's become clear who is going to go up against Donald Trump in the next U.S. election, which is happening this fall. Who is that candidate, and what major criticism has he received lately or recently? There's been I don't know if you'd call it a smear campaign, but certainly an accusation made upon him about his treatment of a particular, I think she was an employee or somebody who worked closely with him many, many years ago. And so who is this guy who's going to be going up against Donald Trump? And what is this dark cloud, this stain of a accusation that hangs over him? That kind of question is exactly the kind of question I'll be considering making for for this kind of test. These are things that I certainly would expect somebody who's even had a passing sort of just checking the headlines of what's been going on should be able to answer a question like that. And by the way, the answer is Joe Biden, and he's been accused of sexual misconduct with a former person who worked with him when he was senator. And this was 30 or so years ago. I don't remember the exact date, but a long time ago. So, other national news, Canada announced a ban to a bunch of different assault weapons, and this may have very likely been triggered by, or at least related to, the gunmen going on the killing spree that they did in Nova Scotia. When it comes to international news, Trump's been making news for a variety of things that don't have anything to do with COVID, although some have, right? He made news by suggesting maybe we should drink bleach and that'll kill the bug, and ridiculous things like that have certainly kept him in the news. But he's also been firing a lot of watchdogs and people in his government whose job it is to make sure that he and his people are telling the truth. And he's been firing a ton of these people in the last few weeks. And it's something definitely to be sort of paying attention to, because he's slowly working away at the oversight capacity of the government to force him to behave himself. And it's happening in bits and pieces. But when you look at the connection of all these different people he's fired, he's basically removing anybody from office that he disagrees with or that he's afraid is going to find out something about what he or his people have done lately. And so that kind of news story, I certainly think people should be aware of as an international story that's U.S. related, for example. Okay. So when it comes to natural disaster news, there certainly is still many eyes that are on the Ethiopia and South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, that whole sort of Eastern and Central African region dealing with a major locust outbreak that people are now concerned is going to end up affecting millions of people's ability to eat, to feed themselves. And it's been exacerbated by the COVID outbreak, makes it harder for people to fight against this locust spread when they have to worry about spreading this disease as well. But some people are arguing that the locust spread is going to end up killing far more people than the disease will if people aren't able to overcome the social distancing aspects and the disease itself. In Africa, it's going to end up the locust problem will end up becoming the larger death toll, unfortunately. And that hasn't happened yet, but it certainly could. So it's a slow motion disaster in the making that people should have their eye on if they've been following the news. Trump administration weakens regulations around mercury and other toxic metals in coal plants. So Trump has slowly been making it easier and easier for coal mines to stay open in the U.S. and working away on regulations that they used to have to follow under the previous president's rules. There's a new study out that shows that Harvard has done that showed that there's way more methane leaks coming from oil and natural gas. What the heck what's the word I'm looking for? Like oil rigs and drilling areas than they ever used to think was happening. And methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. So it turns out that there's a lot of escaped methane gas that's coming out when they pump oil or natural gas out of the ground that they never knew or weren't willing to admit until this independent study was done. And what that means is that the greenhouse gas emissions, even from oil and natural gas, are as bad or worse than coal. And coal used to be seen as by far the worst thing we could use to burn to make our energy. But now with this new data, the methane leaks that come from it's the Permian oil basin. It's down in southern United States where they did this study, but it shows a lot of leakage that we never used to be aware of. And so this adds more complexity to the idea that certain fossil fuels are better than others for greenhouse gases. It turns out they may all be in the very, very bad category. But it's news like that I would consider sort of environmental, that people might be aware of already or may want to take some note on and go and look up a bit more. When it comes to COVID related news, there's a drug called remdesivir, Remdesivir, that has made the news in the last few weeks because it looks promising as a way of treating or at least minimizing the severity of the COVID disease. And so that's been made the news as an antiviral medication that may end up being a useful treatment for COVID. And there's pressure to reopen economies that people may have been following that's been in the news. One thing that's come through in COVID-related news in Canada is that the virus, the deaths related to that virus in Canada are about 80% connected to seniors' residences, long-term care homes, old folks' homes. And that's where by far the majority of our deaths are taking place. And so there's been some consternation about how we can better protect seniors in those homes from contracting this virus, because once it gets into them, it makes the rounds very quickly, because there's people who are taking care of multiple residents and are even working in various long-term care homes and going from one to the other and spreading the disease that way. And so certain rules and regulations have been changed, but to some extent the damage has been done, and many people died in those homes from this disease. Because of systems that were being done a certain way for many years, but now those systems have shown to increase the risk of COVID spread inside those organizations, those places. So when it comes to 3 and 4 letter words, we've got the WHO, the World Health Organization, being criticized for being too subservient to China, and Trump has threatened to pull its funding of the World Health Organization, which a lot of other countries are very sort of worried about because it's a major donor, the major donor in the world, and of all the times where the world needs a World Health Organization to help pull it out of the problems related to COVID, this would, be that time where the WHO is playing an important role. So it sort of seems potentially extra worrisome that the U.S. is so mad that the WHO seemed to be in the pocket of China in the early days of this outbreak, such that he's now threatening to just pull all the funding and sort of let it, fend for itself. The FAO, the world, it's another UN organization. It's the Food and Agricultural Organization. Let's see what we got here. It warns that East African locusts pose an unprecedented threat to the world food supply. We talked about that in a different category. PPE is another acronym that's been in the news like crazy, personal protective equipment. So, that's been in the news in a variety of contexts. The IEA is the International Energy Agency, and it predicts that global demand for oil is going to plummet, and is plummeting the worst since World War II. And it's been keeping track of these kinds of numbers for decades, and it says that it has never seen the world contract in terms of its energy use, which you might say is good for the environment, but for the world's economy, terrible, or a sign of it contracting in a way that's terrible for people's jobs. So that's another sort of organization that made the news recently for its, latest report. There are, a bunch of those kinds of acronyms that are in the news. I mentioned the CERB, Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, earlier as well. It has been criticized recently by Pallister, our province government, for creating a disincentive for people to go back to work. And he's suggesting that, well, if you can get the CERB, why would you decide to go back and actually rejoin your job when you can just keep getting this check from the government? And he sort of implied that people who, once they get it, they're not going to want to work anywhere. And so that Pallister has had a lot of pushback on that. It's a $2,000 check per month, and a lot of people earn a lot more than that in their jobs. So for him to suggest that this is going to make it harder for the economy to go back now because everybody's just going to want to sit at home and do nothing and collect a check, that's a debatable issue, but it's certainly one that made the news recently. So there is a bunch of things. Again, I don't like to sort of get into the sort of sensationalist news, but when we get to like environmental and natural disaster stuff in the news, in the last couple weeks, we've heard mention of something called murder hornets, these Asian giant hornets that have been found in BC and coastal just south of there in the United States. And there's a concern that this new type of bee has made it across the ocean and is going to spread and destroy other types of bees in North America. So that's the kind of news that doesn't relate to COVID, and yet should be and is news that is making headlines and would definitely be bigger headline if it wasn't for COVID getting in the way and being a part of our news cycle so much. But there's certainly plenty of news out there for people to to be following and to be recording. And, this Friday, I'm going to find out who's been making good news notes and who hasn't by how well you can answer some of these big questions. One thing I will leave you with is the Useful Class websites. Okay, when you click on this, you do have the ability under the Useful Class websites subfolder here, I'm thinking it's the very first one. Yeah, it is, Free Press e-edition. You click on that. Now, I've been in here recently, and so it remembers me. It doesn't even ask for my credentials, but the credentials are written on this link right here. If you have to log in because you haven't been in here for a while, the password is there, the login is there. You can use this to read every Free Press going back for weeks and weeks. And I mean, even a cursory scan of some of the big headlines should prepare you for Friday's test. There might be some questions you may or may not know. I'm always going to make sure that there's a choice of questions. So if there's certain ones you didn't study, okay, you leave those out, shouldn't hurt you. So I'm going to make sure that there's a lot of different things that that are going to hopefully help people. But I think the button here is editions right here. And you literally have, it just goes back for weeks and weeks that you can check and look in through old newspapers. And the Free Press is a particularly good one to do that with because it has both local and national and international news in it. So it's a great way for you to keep in touch with all levels of news reasonably well. Okay, it does a better job with local news than maybe national and international would for other organizations, but it is a good catch-all for all three levels. So that's one place that you should sort of remember. And then another one, Useful Class website, will go back one level and go just to plain old news sites, which is, again, a place you should have been visiting every few days as you made your own notes. But the Globe and Mail is another great site that you can use. And again, I've been in here recently, so it's showing up DCI Global Issues right away, but there is credentials in the same area. Before you log in, you'll see them right here, how to log in using my email account and this password. And so, again, this is something you can be using to keep up with news. And when you scroll down a little ways, you can get to, where is it? Oh, I guess it's way down at the bottom. You get to something called Globe to Go. And if you click on that, what that is like a version of the Free Press like we just saw. And let me just see here. If I say read today's paper, okay, then it'll show up just like today's paper in that same sort of format that we were just talking about. And I believe you've got at least a week that you can go back. So you can look at the last week's worth of news from the Globe and Mail simply by clicking on a different date. Last Wednesday the 13th, this is the Free Press. This was the Globe and Mail from that date. Okay, so there is a way for people to go back and find out about some news if you've been away from it for a while. I'm certainly doing that tonight. I'm catching up on some older newspapers from the past week before I sit down tomorrow and actually write questions up for this test. And so I wanted to send this video out to people just to give everybody sort of a one final sort of hint session and reminder of what to expect on Friday and how to prepare for it as best you can. Fundamentally, keeping good news notes is what you should be referring to now, and the kinds of questions I'll be asking, I think it's fair to say would be, the biggies, the biggest stuff that most reasonable people would agree, yep, these were big topics in the last couple months. And yeah, there might be a few that you would argue, that's a little more obscure and a little bit less or off the beaten path. But I'll always make sure there's a choice involved in all the sections that I give you so that you can ignore the more arcane or more detailed ones, or at least some of them, and it won't hurt you. And so as long as you've been sort of reviewing the big news over the last few weeks, you should be able to answer the questions on the quiz without too much difficulty. At least that's my hope. So I'm going to end with this, and if there are further questions, you guys are certainly welcome to email me tomorrow. I will be working on creating the test tomorrow, and I may have some better hints to give, but at this point I'm expecting that everybody's got their own pieces that they can now go to, and you can help each other and talk with each other on our teams to help each other with certain questions and topics, and that would be another thing that you could do to get ready. Okay, so I'm hoping that this helps, and I'm hoping I'll see everybody on Friday in the afternoon during our regular class time in Teams, and we'll talk more. Thanks. Bye.